Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
The coffee on Meridian 7 was genuinely excellent, which Cale Doran considered the station's one defensible virtue. Everything else about the place, the recycled air that tasted faintly of someone else's previous decisions, the corridor lighting calibrated to a shade of pale blue that the station's original designers had apparently believed would promote calm, and which actually promoted the specific low-grade irritability of people who feel perpetually underwater. The automated greeting system near the docking bay that welcomed incoming personnel by name with an enthusiasm so aggressively cheerful it bordered on threat. All of it fell somewhere between tolerable and forgettable on the scale of coalition, forward installations he had accumulated opinions about. But the coffee was right. He wrapped both hands around the cup and let the heat work into his palms in the way that people who have spent enough time in pressurized environments learn to appreciate small warmths without making a ceremony of them. And he looked at his food, and he did not look at anything else in the mess hall, because looking at other things in the mess hall required a tolerance for the particular theater of people pretending not to look back. He had been at Meridian 7 for 11 days. 11 days was, in his experience, approximately the amount of time it took a new posting's personnel population to complete the social processing cycle that began with curiosity, moved through research, and arrived at the settled consensus of keep a reasonable distance, which was fine. He had made peace with reasonable distance the way one makes peace with a recurring weather condition, not by liking it, but by wearing the right coat. The grain bowl in front of him had been described on the serving display as Harvest Blend, Station Reserve, which he understood to be the culinary equivalent of a classified document, a name specifically designed to prevent further inquiry. He ate it anyway. It tasted like something that had once been near actual food and retained the memory. The mess hall was running at roughly two-thirds capacity, which at this hour meant the overlap of personnel coming off the night rotation with those beginning the day shift, a combination that produced the specific social atmosphere of people who were either too tired or not yet tired enough to perform their best versions of themselves. Conversations happened in clusters. Chairs scraped. Somewhere near the service counter, someone laughed at something that evidently required explanation to the person next to them, who did not, from the sound of it, find the explanation sufficient. Cale drank his coffee. He registered the shift in the room's ambient noise before he identified its source, a fractional drop in conversational volume, the kind that doesn't announce itself but accumulates, the acoustic equivalent of a room holding its breath without having agreed to do so. He gave it 3 seconds. Then he looked up. She was standing just inside the entrance. Not hesitating, the Velhari did not hesitate in any of the ways that read as uncertainty. They became still in the way of people who are processing, and the distinction was significant if you knew to look for it. She was looking at the room the way a navigator looks at an unfamiliar chart, taking in what was actually there before deciding what it meant. He had seen Velhari personnel at 2 previous postings. He had never had occasion to speak with one at length, which his mission files suggested was not an accident of circumstance so much as a design feature of how command preferred to deploy him, in configurations that minimized the number of parties who would later want detailed explanations. The Velhari, from what he understood, preferred detailed explanations. It was something of a cultural cornerstone. She was built along proportions that processed as human for the first moment, and then gently corrected themselves. Slightly taller, the geometry of her shoulders and jaw carrying an architectural quality, as though her skeleton had been designed with structural intention rather than evolved through the compromises that most species' bodies reflect. Her skin held the Velhari luminescence, a deep brown with something beneath it that was not quite light but behaved like it, the way certain minerals seem lit from inside by a source that isn't there. Her hair fell to her jaw and moved with a quality that the recycled station air did not entirely account for. Her eyes, when they crossed his position during their sweep of the room, were the kind of layered color that took a second look to understand: amber at the center, deep green outward, and beyond that a thin ring of pale silver that gave the whole arrangement the appearance of a phenomenon rather than an eye. Along her jaw, following the bone, there were raised markings, geometric slightly, in the way that coastlines are slightly geometric, shaped by a process that had its own logic even if it wasn't immediately legible. He looked back at his coffee. Around her, the helpful architecture of social discouragement assembled itself with the quiet efficiency of a system that had been practiced on his behalf many times and had now simply found a new application. A senior officer near the service counter tilted his chin toward the far tables in the universal gesture of a person who believes they are being subtle. Two human ensigns became very interested in their food. The station's seating assistance panel, a piece of technology that had never, in Kale's 11 days, assisted anyone with anything, lit up with a soft chime and offered, in 4 languages, a helpful note about availability in the eastern section. She looked at the panel, then she walked toward him, not quickly, not with the energy of a point being made, with the pace of someone who had already finished making the point internally and was now simply arriving at its conclusion. She set her tray on the table across from him. She sat down. She began to eat. She met his eyes with an expression that was completely, unreasonably calm, and somewhere behind that calm was the clear and total acknowledgement that she had read every signal the room had produced and had found none of them, on reflection, persuasive. The mess hall did not go silent. It went quiet in the particular way of 60 people performing conversations they were no longer listening to. Kale looked at her. He looked at his coffee. He drank it. The panel, he said, suggested the eastern section. It did, she said. Her standard was precise in the way of someone who had learned it from sources that respected punctuation. The eastern section has a ventilation fault. 11 days, unaddressed. The air in that section carries 4.3% excess carbon particulate above regulation tolerance. He considered this. So you sat here, he said, for respiratory reasons. She held his gaze in the steady, unornamented way of someone who had no particular interest in lying and found the alternative less effort. I sat here, she said, because it was the correct seat. Her name was Velhari, and she volunteered it the same way she had sat down, without preamble, without the social performance of waiting to be asked, as though names were information and withholding information required a justification she hadn't been given. She said it, and then she said her posting, and then she said the name of her division, and Kale noted each piece with the quiet, reflexive attention of someone who had spent long enough in operational work that listening carefully had stopped feeling like effort and become something closer to breathing. He told her his name in return. She nodded in a way that indicated she already knew it, which was not a surprise, and also that she had known it before sitting down, which was slightly more interesting. You reviewed my file, he said. I reviewed your accessible file, she said, with a precision that he was beginning to understand was not pedantry but accuracy. She considered these different things, and she was correct that they were. There is a meaningful distinction. Your accessible file is approximately 60% of your operational record. The remainder is classified at a level that requires authorizations I don't hold. Most people find the accessible 60% sufficient, he said. Most people, she said, are reading for a conclusion they've already reached. Outside the narrow viewport set into the mess hall's far wall, the gas giant hung in its slow, self-involved rotation, entirely unconcerned with the conversation happening at the corner table. Kale found he had no urgent reason to be elsewhere. This was not a familiar feeling, and he treated it with appropriate suspicion. She ate with the economy of someone who considered meals a practical requirement rather than a social occasion, which he respected. She also, he noticed, arranged her food in a way that suggested the Velhari had opinions about order that extended to tray organization, protein to the left, everything else positioned relative to it with a consistency that was either cultural or personal, and that she clearly did not notice she was doing. The Kesari campaign, he said, not as a question, because she had been moving toward it in the way that conversations move toward the thing both parties know is coming. Is in your accessible file, she said, incompletely. What's in the file is what's in the file. What's in the file, she said, is the mission outcome, the review notation, and the closure of the review by command authorization. What is not in the file is the 3-week period itself, which is logged as a communications blackout due to regional interference, and which regional interference records from the same period do not entirely support. She paused. I noticed the discrepancy. You, Kale said carefully, argued with a personnel AI about my psychological flags, reviewed my operational record for internal consistency, and cross-referenced the environmental data from the Kesari system. In that order, she confirmed. He looked at her for a moment. Why? She appeared to consider the question with genuine seriousness, in the way of someone for whom all questions deserved the same quality of attention regardless of whether their answer was simple or not. Because the version of you that the mess hall has agreed on, she said, was assembled from sources with limited access and significant motivated reasoning. I find motivated reasoning unreliable. I preferred to look at the primary materials. And what did the primary materials tell you? That you are someone who has been sent to situations where the outcome was considered more important than the process, she said, and that this has been useful to command, and that command's comfort with the arrangement is directly proportional to their ability to not look at it too carefully. She picked up her cup. She was drinking water, not coffee, a choice she had made after examining the coffee dispenser's maintenance log with an expression that suggested the log had confirmed a suspicion. That is not a description of a dangerous person. It is a description of a person command finds convenient. Kale said nothing for a moment. Nearby, a table of junior officers had ceased any pretense of their own conversation and were engaged in the coalition-wide sport of watching something unexpected happen while appearing not to watch. You're not trying to make me feel better, he said. I told you already, that's a separate variable. Most people, he said, who look at what you just looked at come away with the version the mess hall has. Most people, she said again with the same cadence as before, and this time she let it sit there without finishing it, which was somehow more pointed than finishing it would have been. He drank his coffee. It was still good. The grain bowl was finished, which was not a loss he mourned. The gas giant outside continued its business. A fourth ensign had joined the two who were watching, and the three of them had the collective expression of people witnessing an event whose category they hadn't yet determined. The ventilation fault in the eastern section, Kale said. You knew about it before you sat down. She looked at him with the amber-green silver of her eyes holding an expression that was not quite amusement and not quite approval and was, he suspected, something that had a specific name in Velhari that Standard hadn't been asked to translate yet. The luminescent quality of her skin shifted fractionally toward gold, barely perceptible, and he noticed it anyway, because noticing was the thing he did. The fault, she said, has been logged with facilities for 11 days. I reviewed the maintenance queue this morning. Before breakfast, I find it useful to know the condition of spaces I intend to occupy. A pause. I had also reviewed the seating distribution patterns of the mess hall across the past 11 days. Your table has had a consistent exclusion radius of approximately 4 meters. Every seat within that radius has gone unoccupied regardless of overall hall capacity. Another pause shorter, except this one. Because you sat in it. Because, she said, setting down her cup with the quiet finality of someone closing a well-reasoned argument. It was the correct seat. He looked at her, she looked at him. The table of junior officers, now numbering 5, had given up all pretense entirely. "You know," Cale said, "most people who want to prove a point about not being afraid of me do it from slightly further away." "I wasn't proving a point," she said. "I was eating lunch." He found, to his considerable inconvenience, that he believed her completely. The signal arrived on the 14th day, which Posick later described as suspicious timing, given that the tertiary thruster assembly had chosen the same day to develop an opinion about its fuel intake calibration, as though the universe had decided that one genuinely unprecedented event per day was insufficient and had opted for 2. Velith found it at 3:40 station time. She did not wake the crew. She woke Cale, which by this point in the transit had become a distinction the rest of the Calanthas had quietly noted and chosen not to comment on, with the collective discretion of people who have correctly assessed that commenting would produce a conversation. None of them had the energy to navigate. He was already awake. He was always awake at this hour, a fact she had known for 12 days without mentioning it, and he had known she knew, and neither of them had made anything of it because making something of it would have required agreeing on what it was, which the situation had not yet demanded. She showed him the readings without preamble. The signal was coming from the coordinate cluster at the center of the 4 incompatible charts, the point that all 4 surveys had managed to approach and then, in their data, gently failed to see clearly. It was not broadcasting in any format the Calanthas' linguistic database recognized, which the database communicated by producing a readout of negative matches, so comprehensive it had the quality of a very long, very polite admission of defeat. "It's directed," Velith said, "not ambient, not residual." She pulled the waveform analysis onto the secondary screen. "It is responding to our approach." Cale looked at the readings for a long time. Outside the viewport, the Verath expanse held its dark, unhelpful silence, and somewhere in it, at a distance, the sensors were still resolving. Something very old had noticed them and was deciding what to say about it. "I'll file the report," he said. "I'll co-sign it," she said. He looked at her. "It will carry more weight," she said, with the practical tone of someone solving a logistics problem, with a navigation specialist's sensor analysis attached. "Command is more likely to respond carefully if the report cannot be dismissed as a combat specialist's interpretation of ambiguous data. You've thought about how command will read this." "I think about how information will be received before I send it," she said. "It saves time." The report went out at 500. Command's response arrived 8 hours later, which in Cale's experience indicated that the people receiving the report had needed to have a meeting, and that the meeting had needed to have a follow-up meeting, and that someone in the follow-up meeting had eventually said something that ended the process of having meetings and initiated the process of sending a response. The response authorized continued observation at distance and requested, in the secondary notes section, that command used for things it didn't want in the primary record, a threat assessment from the combat specialist. Cale read the secondary note. He showed it to Velith. She read it with the cool blue-silver undertone that he had come to understand meant she was troubled and had decided that being troubled was less useful than being direct. "They want to know if they should be afraid of it," she said. "They want me to tell them how afraid," he said, "so they can decide what kind of response afraid justifies." "And what are you going to tell them?" He had been thinking about this since 340. He had been thinking about it in the way he thought about things that mattered, not constructing an answer from available components, but waiting for the answer that was already there to make itself known, which was a process that looked from the outside like stillness, and was from the inside something considerably more active. "The truth," he said, which was not an answer he had given command in every situation he'd been placed in, and which he registered as a change in himself with the same quiet attention he gave to anything worth noticing. The Calanthas moved to the authorized observation distance over the following hours, and the structure, because structure was the only word that fit, though it fit imprecisely. the way all available words fit things that exist before language has caught up to them. Resolved on the sensors with the gradual clarity of something that was allowing itself to be seen rather than being discovered. It was enormous. Posick, who had come to the navigation bay to report a minor victory over the fuel intake calibration, looked at the sensor image for a full 30 seconds and then said, with the reverence of a man confronting something larger than his usual grievances, "Well, that's a thing." Then he went back to the engine corridor because the thruster assembly did not pause for existential encounters. The signal strengthened as they held position. Velith ran the analysis with the concentrated focus of someone who has found the most important work of her life and is treating every second of it accordingly. She worked for 6 hours without stopping, cross-referencing the signal structure against every xenolinguistic framework in the database, building a translation scaffold from pattern recognition alone, the way a navigator builds a position from reference points when the charts have run out. Ress brought her coffee at hour 3. She drank it without looking away from the screens, which Ress reported to Quell in the tone of someone describing a marvel. Quell said, "She's happy," and Ress said, "She doesn't look happy," and Quell said, "That's what happy looks like when it's real," and Ress thought about this for the rest of the transit. Cale wrote his threat assessment. He wrote it with the directness of someone who had decided, sometime between a mess hall on a station orbiting a gas giant and the 14th day of a transit through the Verath expanse, that the most useful thing he could offer command was accuracy rather than the particular shape of answer that made their decisions easier. The structure was not a threat. It was communicating. What it was communicating would require time and patience, and the kind of careful, unhurried attention that Velith was already giving it, and the operational recommendation was continued observation, cooperative approach when the linguistic framework was sufficiently developed, and the assignment of a full xenolinguistic team at the earliest opportunity. He added, in his own secondary note, that the navigation officer's analysis had been essential to every finding in the report. That without her instinct for reading what was actually present rather than what instruments suggested should be present, the signal would have been logged as interference, and the mission would have turned around. He wrote this not because protocol required it, but because it was true, and he had arrived, somewhere along the way, at a position where true things wanted to be said. When Velith finally sat back from the screens, at hour 7, the signal analysis had produced the beginning of a structural framework. Not translation, not yet, but the architecture of understanding, the point where a code stops being noise and starts being a language waiting for time. She looked at what she had built with the expression of someone standing at a door they have worked very hard to find. "It's been transmitting for a long time," she said. "The decay patterns in the signal suggest the source is very old. Possibly older than the coalition, possibly older than any of the species in it. What's it saying?" She was quiet for a moment. The gold undertone of her skin was fully present now, steady and warm in the navigation bay's light. "Something like a greeting," she said. "Something like 'We wondered when you would find this. We left it for you.' A pause. The grammar is difficult, but the intention is patient. It has been waiting without being certain anyone was coming. And it left the message anyway." Cale sat with that for a while. Outside, the structure held its ancient, self-possessed silence, and the signal continued its patient repetition. The way a light left in a window continues long after the person who lit it has stopped watching for an answer. "We should tell the crew," he said. "Yes," she said. She looked at him with the layered amber-green silver of her eyes, and the gold was in them too, or something that functioned like it, the Velhari equivalent of the particular warmth that exists in a moment when something is exactly what it should be. Cale. It was the first time she had used his name without his rank preceding it. He noticed this with the full, unhurried attention he gave to things that were actually important. "You wrote the truth in your report," she said. It was not a question. She had read it while he was making the coffee, the good coffee, which he had made specifically, because some moments deserve the right cup. It seemed like the right time to start, he said. She accepted this with the small, still quality of Velhari acknowledgement, and then she said, "The mess hall on Meridian 7, the seat." "What about it?" "I told you it was the correct seat," she said. "I want you to know I was not referring only to the ventilation." He handed her the coffee. She took it. Around them, the Calanthas held its position in the deep of the Verath expanse, and from the engine corridor came the distant,